Go ahead and get started. This is Scott Parkin from Rainforest Action Network, and I just want to welcome everyone to the webinar that we're having tonight. We're very excited for tonight's webinar. The first thing we'd like to do is ask folks who are on the call with us if you could introduce yourselves in the chat box. If you want to say your name, your pronoun, and where you're joining us from today, that would be really great. So go ahead and do that. And then I am gonna share my screen and go to the slideshow. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. And so just to kind of like start off, we're in a unprecedented moment in history. Right now we're seeing rallies, protests, direct actions, mass rallies, and really no other word right now to describe it, but uprisings going on around the country and even other parts of the globe in solidarity with the movement for Black Lives. And so what we wanted to do in the organizing team at Rainforest Action Network was ways in which we could like support that movement and all of the people in the streets. We had done a Know Your Rights training for our staff a couple of weeks ago and decided to bring it to like our the folks in our activist network to kind of get some thoughts in your head about things to do and know and not know when you're out in the streets. And then the other important piece is that we very much at Rainforest Action Network, we are very much aligned with the movement for Black Lives and wanted to make sure that we were following Black leadership. And so the other part of this webinar will be about being in solidarity, how climate activists, how environmental activists can be in solidarity with the movement for Black Lives. And so that being said, I'm very excited. I am moving the slide. There we go. That being said, I'm very excited that we're going to be joined by Regan with the Civil Liberties Defense Center. And then we're also going to be joined by Reverend Lennox Yearwood with the Hip Hop Caucus to sort of like one part, Know Your Rights briefing, other part, just like a discussion about how to be best in solidarity in this moment with the movement for Black Lives. And then just a real quick intro, joined by RAND's webinar team today. So like I said, I'm Scott Parkin, Organizing Director, and I'll just let the team introduce themselves in order really quickly.
Hey everyone, this is Ethan Nuss. I use he, him pronouns. I'm organizing strategist on our organizing team, and I am based in Dakota Territory in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and very grateful for you all joining tonight.
Hey y'all, this is Sarmishta. I'm joining from Lenape-Hoking Territory in central New Jersey. I am the New York City area organizer with RAN, and I will be one of 2 people on tech support today.
Hey everyone, this is Molly Prendergast here. I am the Development Operations Associate with Rainforest Action Network, and I'm coming to you live from the Ohlone Territory in Berkeley, California. Super happy to be here.
Thanks, Shaw. And I actually didn't say this before, but I'm actually in Ohlone Territory in Berkeley, California as well. And so one other thing we wanted to say is we just had a quick RAND statement and some webinar guidelines we wanted to put out there and ask just people to think about is that Rainforest Action Network will continue to stand with Black Lives Matter, our partners, Indigenous peoples, and frontline communities. RAN supports Black lives and stands with protesters across the country demanding an end to police violence and extrajudicial murders of Black people. And you know, we've actually had some trolling of some of our work recently, and so we just want to say that we're not tolerating comments about all lives matter or anything that's racist or offensive. If someone does break these rules, we're going to ask them to leave, and if necessary, we'll remove them from the webinar today. And then moving on, I'm going to hand it off to our first presenter, which is Regan with the Civil Liberties Defense Center.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so I'm Regan. I'm the executive director and one of the senior staff attorneys at the CLDC. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently in Kalapuya territory, which is Eugene, Oregon. And this is my contact information in case anybody has any follow-up questions. We do a full 3-part Know Your Rights training for climate activists. But for today, I am assuming that people are gearing up for Juneteenth actions along with other actions that are maybe not strictly climate related. So I plan to just kind of run through some basic rights, particularly when interacting with cops, and then take a short minute to talk about some Know Your Rights during COVID-19, how to kind of keep activists safer as we are taking to the streets and maybe being less than 6 feet between each other. So first of all, because I don't know whether everyone on this webinar is in California or Oregon or somewhere else, we're going to kind of focus on US constitutional rights because those apply to everyone. Whether you're a US citizen or not, we have the same constitutional rights. And just as a nod to the political times that we're in, I say that statement, but I think we are all more aware than ever before that systemic racism, particularly in the justice system and in the legal system, is rampant. And so although we technically and legally all have the same constitutional rights, we also, very much recognize that those rights are not enforced or upheld in the same ways. But for the purposes of this training and trying to be brief and concise, we're going to focus on your Fifth Amendment, which is your right to remain silent, your Fourth Amendment, which is your right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and then your First Amendment, which is your right to protest. So looking at your Fifth Amendment, you never, ever, ever have to answer any question put to you by anyone. The only person that can ever make you answer a question is a judge in a courtroom. So no matter where you go or what you are dealing with, if you are ever asking yourself, do I really have to answer that? The answer is almost always no. Unless you're in a courtroom and a judge is, wagging their finger at you. Now, when it comes to exercising some of your rights, there are minor exceptions to this where the legal system and the court system has come up with this case law that slightly alters those rights. And one of the ways that has been altered is in order to assert your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, you actually have to say words. You actually have to break your own silence and say the words, I want to remain silent, or I'm asserting my Fifth Amendment. If you don't say that, you are not properly invoking the right so that it can be used in your defense in court. So as I whip through these slides, when you see these words in red down at the bottom, we call these your magic words. These are words that you should memorize because, number one, they will perfect your legal right. If you end up in a courtroom, you've said everything you need to say for your lawyer to be able to use them as a defense for you. Number two, no matter how many times you deal with cops, the adrenaline starts flowing, you get nervous, and sometimes words kind of come out of people's mouths that they later regret. And if you actually memorize these phrases and create some tongue memory for yourself, our hope is that these words will come out instead of some of the other ones. So I wish to remain silent, or I want to remain silent, is the way that you invoke your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. And this is my little image for only a judge can make you break that bubble. So when you say the words, I want to remain silent, or I want a lawyer, this is called your invocation of Fifth Amendment rights, or taking the fifth. And when you say those words, it puts this magic bubble around you that makes it so that the cops must stop questioning you. Now, if you then voluntarily start chatting up with them in the backseat of the cop car, you've just popped your bubble, and now the cops are going to be allowed to question you again. But just by repeating that phrase, I want to remain silent and I want a lawyer, you put the bubble back around you. So there are lots of reasons not to talk to cops, none more so than now. But as political activists in particular, there are a lot of reasons why, as political movement participants, we have an ethic to not talk to cops. In fact, most movements will have a designated police liaison, which should be the only person seen talking to cops for the most part. In fact, if you are off on the sidelines having an intimate conversation with a cop at a protest or a rally, chances are you're going to be viewed with a lot of suspicion from your comrades. But there are a lot of different laws. Some of them are confusing. You might think you know what you're doing, and then you might actually be entrapping yourself or admitting to something. You might say the sun rises in the east. The cop writes down that you said that the sun rises in the west. That could be a problem for you down the road. Cops are allowed to lie to you. We'll talk about this a few different times. Cops are absolutely allowed to lie to you when they are investigating crimes. And sometimes you cannot talk your way out of trouble. Tears are not often an effective way to get out of the backseat of a cop car, nor is political debate often very helpful. Cops, especially if they are undercover, are allowed to break the law with you. They are allowed to do drugs with you. They're allowed to date you, all while investigating you for crimes. So just be careful. Trust is an important thing. And the more risk that you are taking on the streets, the more you should know the people that you're engaging in that risk with. All right. So the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply if you are subpoenaed to a grand jury proceeding, which we do a whole separate 1-hour training on grand juries. Check it out. If a court orders you, or if you're in contempt proceedings. So again, those magic words, I want to remain silent and I want a lawyer. Turning to the Fourth Amendment, which is your right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, the cops grabbing you, shooting you with rubber bullets, tear gassing you, hitting you with a baton, all of that is potentially a violation of your Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. And possibly slightly comical is this idea that the magic words to assert your Fourth Amendment rights are, I don't consent to this search. Often it is, I'm not going to resist you, but I don't consent to this search under certain circumstances. Edward Snowden, kind of famous for this quote, when you say I don't care about the right to privacy because I have nothing to hide, that is no different than saying I don't care about freedom of speech because I have nothing to say, or freedom of press because I have nothing to write. So the cops cannot search you, your possessions, your home, your car, unless certain things happen. And the most common thing that's going to happen is that you're going to consent and give them permission to do it. You're going to turn what would have been an illegal search into a legal search by consenting to it. They can also obtain a search warrant. If they have a search warrant, that means they can, potentially break down the door while you're not home and search your stuff. In addition to your consent to search, the courts have ruled that children as young as 10 years old can consent to the cops entering your home and searching it. Guests, roommates, even a talking dog could potentially give consent to a search. And there are many exceptions to the search warrant requirements as well. But no matter what, whether they show up with a piece of paper called a search warrant, or whether they claim it's an exception to a search warrant, you still just want to say, I'm not going to resist you, but I don't consent to the search. That way, if it turns out that that warrant has a technical problem, you might have a defense and all of the evidence might get thrown out. But if you say, well, I guess you've got a warrant, so you're going to come on in, you have just basically consented to an unlawful search. Now, I mentioned you've got this Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, but if you remain silent, that means, if a cop walks up to you and says, can I search your backpack? And you just stand there and silently stare at them, you have literally said, yes, officer, go ahead and search my backpack. Because under the law, with regard to the Fourth Amendment, silence equals consent to search. So in order to assert your Fourth Amendment right to a search, you have to say the words, I don't consent. Warrants, children can say yes to that. One of the main exceptions to the search warrant requirement is for cars. And also, maybe not so much in San Francisco, but in a lot of places, the most common place for activists to get popped by the cops is when they're leaving an action or leaving a protest, and you get into your car and you're driving away and you're picked off by law enforcement. That claims that you didn't use a blinker or they couldn't see your taillight or something along those lines. The driver of the vehicle must produce a driver's license to show that they have privileges to drive on the road. If they don't, they can be arrested. But the cop does not have the right to ask for ID or for the names of all of the passengers in the car. In order for the cop to be able to ID the passengers, the cop has to articulate what crime each passenger is alleged to have committed or about to commit. So otherwise, if you're pulled over in your car, cops have the right to search within your wingspan. If you hold your arms out like that, it's supposed to protect officer safety so that I don't go grab something and, use it to injure them. But that means that if you're pulled over in your car, the cop is going to be able to look in the dash, look under your seat, look in the console, because all of those things are within your wingspan, but they're not going to be able to search the trunk of your car without a warrant because you can't reach back there. I'm not going to resist you, but I don't consent to this search. First Amendment allows all sorts of things. I think most people on this call, know about all the things that the First Amendment allows. There's very, very limited types of speech that are not protected. I don't think that's the focus of today's training, so I'm going to quickly skim over that. Incitement and advocacy of crime. If I get up here and I teach you how arson was used during the abolition period to take slaves to freedom, I am abstractly teaching that. If I then taught all of you how to build incendiary devices and sent you off with a toolkit, that's probably going to be advocacy of criminal activity, and I could be responsible for any of your actions if you actually broke the law. This is probably more for a different training, but just know that when the where, when, and how you protest or you exercise First Amendment rights matters. Under the court dogma, it's called the time, place, and manner restriction. If you've ever had the cops tell you there's a free speech zone, or they tell you that now you can't stand on the public sidewalks or you can't take to the streets, those are restrictions being put on your First Amendment rights. And the only way that the state can restrict those rights is if they can establish that it's a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction on those rights. So you have the maximum First Amendment rights at traditional public forums, which includes streets, sidewalks in front of the courthouses, parks, national forest lands. Those are all where you have the most expansive First Amendment rights. It's tough for them to restrict those rights unless you're Trump on a photo op. Public roads are considered those traditional public forum. However, if you are blocking traffic, the cops can announce that that is an unreasonable exercise of your First Amendment rights, and they can say, leave or be arrested. If you leave, you go home. If you don't leave, you can be arrested and subjected to criminal charges. Free speech zones, we hate those. These don't really necessarily apply. Private property includes shopping centers, private residences, parking lots of shopping centers. You know, all of those things are private property. You have no constitutional rights on them. However, do know that anywhere the public can go, you have the right to go. It's just that if you're asked to leave by the person in charge and you refuse to leave the private property, then you can be arrested for trespassing. So I can walk into the Bank of America and go stand in the lobby and make a bunch of noise and do my activism. And that is legal until the bank manager comes up to me and says, leave or be arrested. And really, normally they'll call the cops and the cops are going to come and say, leave or be arrested. If I leave at that point, I should be able to avoid arrest. If I remain and sit down and lock myself to something, then obviously I may be subject to arrest. So in the context of a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests that are going on, a lot of them are talking about the streets, you know, and public sidewalks and more mass gatherings, all of which is absolutely First Amendment protected. Now, we always see cops and the state using pretexts in order to try to limit those rights. And so one of the most common ways that the state will try to shut down a protest is by saying things that you are violating health and safety. That's the most common way that they're going to try to shut down your protest. That something that's going on is unsafe or unhealthy. And as a result of that, they're going to have to shut the protest down. And then they start giving you orders like leave or be arrested. And if you refuse to leave, they'll arrest you for disobeying a lawful order, which will probably be found to be unconstitutional once you get to court. But in the meantime, you've just been arrested and now you're being taken to a dirty COVID-laden jail facility, which, you know, can also be problematic at this point. And we can talk about that more. There's not really a way to prevent this type of thing from happening in the moment. You know, you can't really debate with a line cop on whether your constitutional rights are being violated. Often this is done, you know, for years after a protest through the federal legal system. Sometimes in certain circumstances, you can kind of preempt them by filing injunctions and other court stuff, but it's still the legal system, that inherently, you know, systemically racist legal system. With juveniles, just know that juvies have all the same rights as adults, but if they get arrested and taken to jail, you know, as adults, we can normally get released on our own recognizance for minor crimes, or we can even bail ourselves out. Juveniles must have a parent or guardian go to the jail facility to get them. In most states, if you are arrested, you must be arraigned within 48 or 72 hours. In Oregon, it's 48. In California, Washington, a lot of West Coast places, it's 72. Normally 72 hours is about the longest before you're arraigned. At an arraignment, you want to ask to be released on your own recognizance. That is a phrase that just basically means you want to be released without bail. You want to be allowed to let yourself out And as long as you have a local address that you can use, and you haven't had a bunch of failure to appear for other court dates, you're not on probation or parole, you should be able to ask to be released on your own recognizance. Juvies don't have that right. But otherwise, pretty much the rights are generally the same. Remember that, you know, especially these days, cameras are everywhere. You know, both Big Brother is on cameras outside every coffee shop. Cops are now wearing badge cams. The cop cars have in-car video. And of course, there are tons and tons of people who are constantly live streaming on FaceCrack and other places. Do know that if you are filming your comrades as they commit crimes, you are cooperating with the state. By putting that video out where the state can access it, if you aren't blurring faces, if you are literally showing the identities of people who are allegedly committing crimes, the cops are just sitting back at their desks collecting up all of this video. And we've seen a number of instances where a day or two later, they show up at somebody's door with an arrest warrant, and they're charging them oftentimes with felonies as a result of just sitting around and watching all of this video. So you need to be really careful about what you are videotaping and where you are posting it. Also, know that the courts have ruled that your cell phone is the equivalent of 100 filing cabinets full of confidential information. So if you're going to take your phone out to a protest or out to an action, you need to make sure that it is, number one, password protected, not with your thumbprint or a facial scan. It needs to be, you know, at least a 6-digit password. And you need to make sure that you can activate that password quickly if cops come grabbing for your phone. Number two, you know, you should be using encrypted cell phone apps like Signal, Wire, Keybase, because your cell phone, if you're using regular text messaging or you're talking on your cell phone without using one of those encrypted apps, cops don't even need a warrant or a subpoena to be able to listen in and capture your conversations. We also know that the surveillance state has all sorts of technology. We do a separate training called Digital Security for Activists, but there are different ways where the state can use technology to monitor cell phone activity, to monitor motion. You know, often your cell phone can actually be used as a way for the cops to be able to see where a bunch of movement is happening on a GPS map. So if everybody is heading for a particular building, let's say, cops can monitor GPS satellite information to see where all of those cell phones are heading in order to, you know, basically capture stuff. Don't, you know, as activists, we don't cooperate with the state. We don't give information about ourselves or others. In social justice activism, there's two teams. There's the state and then there's the social activist side. You have to pick a team. If you cross over and start helping the state out, now you're on the state team and you don't get to come back to our team. So there's a very, very clear ethical line between cooperation and non-cooperation with the state. And if you are not familiar with security culture and those mores, you should very much learn about them before you go out onto the streets, because nobody chooses to be the target of a grand jury subpoena. But if you happen to be on the streets and you happen to be front row for a criminal act and the cops contact you and get your name, and then later on you receive a grand jury subpoena, under the ethical guidelines of social justice actors, there is going to be a lot of pressure on you to not cooperate with that grand jury, which could potentially result in up to 6 months in jail for resisting a grand jury. So know the risks that you are taking and be careful to honor your own limits. If something feels unsafe to you, you probably should move to another place. There are plenty of ways to be involved in a movement without extending your risk beyond what you feel comfortable with. Cops will lie. You can't lie to the cops. Make sure your hands are visible. Don't make any quick movements. We all know that that generally has resulted in harm to humans. You don't have to go anywhere with a cop unless they place you under arrest. You're probably being recorded by the cops, especially inside the cop car. You have the absolute right to videotape law enforcement. Public cops doing public duties in public don't have rights to privacy. As long as you're not in their face so much that you're interfering with an investigation. If you have weapons on you when you're arrested, you probably want to tell the cop that before they find them. They tend to get a little annoyed at that. Be careful of sarcasm and debate on recordings. Be polite but firm in asserting your rights. I'm going to skip over this part. If you do end up getting handcuffed, especially with zip ties, if you can put your hands together in like the prayer position but behind your back, this best protects the nerves that you have, which basically can lead to your hands and especially your thumbs going numb or tingling. That's normally temporary, but you do have the right to have your cuffs checked for tightness, including if they are zip ties. If you are arrested, don't forget to say all those magic words. I don't consent to any searches. I want a lawyer. I want to remain silent. Know that jail phones are always recorded. You do have the right to a lawyer, but we know that, you know, there's all sorts of excuses that they may give for that. If you are at a demo where there is a jail support number or a legal hotline or anything like that, you probably want to make sure that you write it somewhere on your body, because they're going to take your cell phone away from you once you're in custody or once you're in jail. And you may not want to write it on your forearm like that, because at Standing Rock, the cops scrubbed people's arms just to mess with them. So putting it somewhere a little less obvious might be helpful. Be careful if you are in a jail cell about them putting undercovers in your jail cell or listening in on your conversations or your phone calls. Transgender people, for most places in the country right now, they will be housed based on their current biological anatomy. There are some more progressive jails that are doing better and have come into the 21st century. But even if you've had your ID changed, oftentimes you will be housed based on current biological anatomy. Every jail must keep you safe though, but often for transgender people, that means choosing between segregation or the general population, which can be problematic. If you have transdermal piercings, we have a special little Know Your Rights card for transdermal piercings, because jailers tend to try and rip those out of people's body parts because they think that you are lying when you say you can't remove it yourself. Medical care, you are entitled to medical care, but you probably won't get very good medical care, especially in a mass arrest situation. And even if you are carrying your inhaler with you, they may not allow you to use it because it has to come in through a pharmacy. So those people that have very necessary medical care or health issues, you know, number one, be careful, because we're seeing all sorts of chemical weapons being used on the streets right now, and that can definitely impact people who have asthma and other things. But number two, you just need to be a really squeaky wheel if you are taken into custody, and just demand that they acknowledge your medical needs. Okay, so I think at that point, I want to just skip really quickly to some special things on COVID and protest. So most places in the US are starting to open up, but just know that you know, there are both federal, state, and local levels of emergency powers acts. You know, there's a federal one from back in 1976 that literally allows them to shell out the National Guard to be local law enforcement and to provide sanitation and other things like that. The National Lawyers Guild is doing a regular update right now on this URL that I put out here. You know, as standards change and as the rules are changing, they're trying to update that KYR page. So I would suggest that you take a look at that down the road. The state of emergency generally is not going to end until Congress says it does, or the president declares that it is over. States and different governors can also impose these types of state powers that can include curfews and quarantines, rationing goods, suspending alcohol, limiting public gatherings, many of which we have seen, you know, all over the country right now. And like I mentioned, National Guard can be deployed by states to enforce quarantines and assist cops in shutting down gatherings. If you ever went off to Standing Rock and you saw those National Guard dudes that were kind of guarding the entrance to camp, the reason that they were there was because the governor declared a state of emergency as a result of Standing Rock, and thus he recruited the National Guard to be the cops in case they wanted to shut it down. California certainly knows all about shelter in place and stay-at-home orders, curfews. Basically, you know, a lot of places around the country are seeing at least nighttime curfews, if not worse. Many, many of them are totally unconstitutional. We're about to file a big lawsuit in the next couple of days challenging blanket curfews that are being thrown around as if we didn't have a constitution. Quarantines, you know, basically have to be a court order if they are actually a formal official quarantine. Some places were threatening to charge people with things like terrorism crimes for coughing on people or licking products in stores and stuff like that. Over 45 states had passed some form of ban on mass gatherings. Most of those are still in place, actually. For a lot of places, it's up to 100 people, but certainly we're seeing far more than 100 people. Based on the current science, being outdoors is far safer in terms of virus spread than being indoors. Being outdoors in an area that you cannot be more than 6 feet apart, wearing a mask, especially a mask with a filter, is definitely the best practice. In my experience at most of the Black Lives Matter protests that I've been a part of and have seen, most people are doing the you know, community standard of wearing masks. You know, carry some hand sanitizer, do your hands up as much as you can. You know, try to take good care of yourself. Try not to huff tear gas and other things. If you do, you know, make sure that you get respiratory care and treatment. You know, here in Oregon, we actually just discovered that a lot of the tear gas that's being used is from like 2007. And expired tear gas is actually even additionally harmful on respiratory systems. And for the most part, you know, most of the indiscriminate use of force that we're seeing around the country, in my opinion, is absolutely illegal and unconstitutional, and there will probably be a ton of federal civil rights cases against cops in cities for, you know, the next decade to come. And I think with that, I will open it up to any Q&A that you all might have before.
I think we're going to actually, hey, Lauren, this is Scott. I think we're going to save the questions for the end just because the Reverend's ready.
Yeah.
If that's cool.
Of course.
Okay. All right. All right, folks. This is Scott with Rainforest Action Network again. I want to thank Lauren for the Know Your Rights presentation. And then I'm also now very excited to introduce Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr. Reverend Yearwood is the president and founder of the Hip Hop Caucus. He's a minister, a community activist, U.S. Air Force vet, one of the most influential people in hip hop political life. Reverend Yearwood is a leader in campaigns calling for divestment from fossil fuels, causing climate change, increasing diversity in the climate movement, ensuring everyone has clean water and air, and international efforts to address climate change. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Reverend Yearwood.
Thank you so much. Wow, I love that last presentation. That was amazing. I needed a lot of those. It could be that little trick on the zip ties. I learned that just from getting arrested quite a few times, but I wish I had known it on the beginning. So those of you who are watching, please, I hope you took good notes, because there was a lot of great information in that presentation. So first, thank you for having me. This is an incredibly important time, and I really wanted to participate in this conversation with you because I knew how important this moment is. Let me just lead off by a few quick announcements before I get into what I want to talk about, which was Stop the Money Pipeline, the campaign that I was able to kick off with my dear friend, Bill McKibben, and then have great groups like Brand and so many other 350 other groups that have been, I think over 100 groups, to be honest, that have now joined the coalition, including the Hip Hop Caucus. So it's a really powerful campaign. Before I get to Stop the Money Pipeline, let me just kind of talk a little bit about what's kind of happening. Tomorrow is Juneteenth. Very, very powerful. And regardless of what the president has said, he didn't make Juneteenth a holiday. It wasn't on him. He didn't, we knew about Juneteenth before Donald Trump. Hate to bust the bubble on that one, but we did. And so it's a very powerful holiday for African Americans, and it comes at a critical time as we are fighting for so many, from Tony McDade, Rashard in Atlanta, obviously George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and this, unfortunately, there's too many people. And then you also have the situation of COVID-19, the devastation with COVID-19 on the Navajo Nation, African American communities, particularly people of color, has been tremendous. So tomorrow is Juneteenth, a very powerful marker, and I think it is taking on new life in our movement. So tomorrow, the Movement for Black Lives will be organizing on the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st. You can actually figure out if you want to participate either on the couch or in the streets. So it's your choice. And you can wear a mask either place too. You can wear a mask on your couch, or you can wear a mask. Definitely wear a mask in the streets. Definitely wear a mask. And I agree with the filter. I will have my my mask with filter and all that good stuff. I'm in Washington, D.C., so we'll be bringing the pain, so to speak, tomorrow in the nation's capital. But please wear a mask if you're in the streets, definitely. But you can find out more about that at 619.com, how to just get engaged in that process. It's also the Poor People's Campaign has their mobilization for just a moral movement around the ending of poverty in this country and lifting up poor people. As many of you know, I'm originally from the great state of Louisiana. And so having come through Hurricane Katrina, which is actually how I began to really get engaged with the climate movement, which now will be 15 years this year. It's just amazing for me. I'm still heartbroken by what happened to my community. But definitely we saw in this country, Black people and poor people were left behind in the richest country in the world. And I think, to be honest, it is something where I think our climate movement should have been more engaged. I really believe that there's no separation between climate justice and racial justice. And so I think our movement should have seen from Hurricane Katrina and been engaged with seeing Black people particularly left behind. And so it's a little frustrating, I will tell you, the fact of the matter that actually, if you think about it, the climate movement could have predated the 21st century version of the movement for Black Lives, which really took off with around Oscar Grant and then Trayvon Martin and so forth and so on. And to this day, still kind of looks like they're figuring out, what to do and what not to do. So I am encouraged though, because you have seen so many new groups popping up, from the Sunrise Movement, 0 Hour, Hip Hop Caucus, and many other groups, particularly Black, Brown, and Red, and also the power of, white people, not just being white allies, but wanting to be white accomplices in this movement. So I'm excited that even though it took us 15 years to get here, we're at a critical juncture. So anyways, if you want to be a part of the Poor People's Campaign, you just go to June2020.com, and you can then find out all about that. It's happening. And then for us, Hip Hop Caucus, we've been pushing for defund the police for quite some time. This didn't start now, but if you want to figure out more about our campaign about defund the police, please go to hiphopcaucus.org. So anyway, let me get to something about the pipeline. It was mentioned earlier about Standing Rock. I was in Standing Rock for quite a bit of that amazing rebellion and gathering and just spiritual event that took place. That shaped me, Minnie Wachoni Waters' life. And that actually, to me, is also the beginning of when, even though I was myself and Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben were on tour way back in 2012 with Stop the Money, Do the Math tour, and the divestment movement came out of that. I really believe that the effort to really connect the dots about looking at how our financial system is propping up the failed fossil fuel industry, it really connects to me around Standing Rock, and how they really pointed out Wells Fargo and a number of other things in that regard. And so, so to me, that's actually one of the successes regarding that. I mean, there's a lot of successes, but I think that's one of the key ones that we really crystallize this moment of the financial component. So you can go to stopthemoneypipeline.com and get all the information, but let me just kind of run through a few things. The key impetus of this process is that we literally want the financial sector, the insurance companies, the banks, the financial advisors, to stop propping up the failed fossil fuel state, and to literally transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. Their business plan simply means a death sentence for us. It is killing us. And so we cannot allow that. There's no way in the world that we can allow you to profit off of our deaths. That can't happen. We must stop that. And so even it means that we must put ourselves into the gears of the machine to bring that madness to a stop, then we must do that. And that's kind of what Stop the Money Pipeline has become, and it's become amazing. Now, I want to discuss up to RAND, Rainforest Action Network, and many other groups like that who've been doing this great work. I mean, from not only here, but obviously from over in South America and other parts of the world. I love the work they do. They go hard. Guys like me, so they go hard to make sure to bring out in both the streets and the suites. That's important. But the Stop the Money Pipeline effort really looks at, one, the banks. So banks like Chase and Wells Fargo. Earlier this year, I was arrested if I needed that little trick I said earlier at a Chase bank protesting. But also the issues of Liberty Mutual, who should be, as an insurance company, should be doing things to protect us as an insurance company. But in a sense, they're protecting the fossil fuel industry, which is why we're calling on them to stop that as well. And groups like BlackRock. Now, BlackRock is interesting because BlackRock obviously insures not only with the fossil fuel company, they said they want to change that, we don't see. But it's also interesting because they're also they also insure some of these failed police states. And so that's a direct connection that we're seeing with a lot of these corporations that are propping up the sinister problems in our community. So the last thing I just kind of want to say in this, because I would love to have your questions around this and have a dialogue or how that process will work. It's really based around for us as a movement. You know, clearly right now, the conversation about Black lives mattering, about how Indigenous people are respected, the pulling down of white supremacy and institutional racism is at the forefront. And I think that sometimes in our movement, we think we must kind of sit to the sideline or kind of not have these conversations about what we need to do to hold the financial sector or any other sector accountable. We've even seen now how Chevron, if many of you know, I call Chevron sometimes, what they're doing the Bay, Chevron. So we see how they're even trying to use this moment. They're literally doing advertisements at Chevron about how, you know, the environmental movement is against the movement for Black Lives Matter. It's amazing how they are literally trying to keep us siloed and separated. And we have kind of contributed to that. We can break that. We can now literally make sure that we break down those silos within our movement. And I think with the money pipeline, you look at issues between not only the divestment from the police departments, or the divestment from fossil fuels, but also, you know, the divestment from the prison industrial complex. I think we're looking at this thing the correct way, about how we can now look at how anything in regards to this financial sector, this capitalism model that looks at extracting and holding people down, we're looking at that differently. And I think that we can now break the silos down and support one another, particularly institutions, groups, and movements that may not have the infrastructure, the resources, even some of the data to literally help out. We can now switch our things over and use our data we have that we use for the fossil fuel industry to hold them accountable, to also in regards to prison industrial complex, to also to defund the police, to also issues regarding immigration and ICE, those kind of things. So I think that this is an incredibly important moment that we have right now. And so, you know, I just thank you so much for taking this time. I'm always excited to be with people who take an evening out to have these conversations. It's my kind of folk who come together on a Thursday evening to dialogue about what we can do to fight for freedom. But I think this is a critically important moment that we're seeing. And so, you know, anyways, I look forward to having a conversation with you and talking more about this. I hope something I've said have stimulated some ideas and some thoughts and some concerns. Maybe you haven't thought about our movement actually being siloed, or even really thought about, you know, how, you know, the connection between racial justice and climate justice. So I would love to, you know, to further that conversation, but definitely, if nothing else, please go to stopthemoneypipeline.com and check out the campaign. Please go to Hip Hop Caucus to see what we're doing in regards to both racial justice and climate justice at the same time, regarding our Defund the Police campaign. Please be a part of some of the protests this weekend in regards to Move for Black Lives with 619, or the Poor People's Campaign with June 2020. But more importantly, don't give up hope on us. You know, our parents fought for equality. And obviously we still are fighting for equality. But now we in the 21st century are not only fighting for equality, but we're fighting for existence. We had a time clock. And so we have to really do all we can do to sacrifice everything to make sure that change happens. So anyway, thanks for having me. All power to the people.
Thank you so much, Reverend Yearwood. I am gonna now, we're gonna ask and see if folks have any questions, and also pass it off to Ethan, if not questions.
Yeah, thank you again, Reverend Yearwood. It's always such a pleasure to hear you speak. I used to live in Washington, D.C., and you know, thank you for recognizing RAN and saying that we go hard, but you know, you go hard. I'd say that every time there was a protest or an action in DC, you'd see Reverend Yearwood there firing up the crowd, and always have a hat, a new hat that matched the message of the campaign. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. And again, if anyone has any praise or questions for Reverend Yearwood, please drop those in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we can have him address those at the end. So Scott, if you would like to put up the slide really quick, I'm gonna help close us out with the call to action. So again, listening to Reverend Yearwood always gets me fired up, and particularly hearing the historic context that he really laid out at the beginning, and the significance of tomorrow, a historic day. 155 years ago, Juneteenth, this holiday really uniquely celebrating Black freedom and Black liberation, for being that date when enslaved people in Texas got the word that they were free from bondage. And as Reverend Yearwood mentioned, Black Lives, the movement for Black Lives is calling for actions across the country, across the world, and Rainforest Action Network, in our dedication to showing solidarity with Black leadership and our commitment to years ago having signed on to their platform for the movement for Black Lives, are helping to answer that call. So as Reverend Yearwood pointed out, if you go to 619.com, and again, I had put that in the chat earlier, and I'll drop it in the chat again now. If you go to 619.com, you can join actions happening. They have a map with actions happening in your community and across the world. And you'll actually be joining, last I checked this afternoon, there was 275 events and growing happening across the world. That's in 45 states, in 3 countries, including France and Nigeria. And 40,000 people had actually pledged to show up and to take action. So the very first link that you'll see there on 619.com is a box where you can sign up directly and pledge to show up to the Juneteenth actions happening tomorrow and throughout the weekend. And for those of you who are maybe listening in on phone and don't have computer access right now, you can also text. So if you text the words DEFEND to the number 90975, again, that's the word DEFEND to 90975, you can also get live updates on how you can plug in and take action. And the last thing I'll say is that we're not only in solidarity and showing up for action, but in lockstep with those demands of the movement for Black Lives. And those 3 demands that they've put forward for Juneteenth and over the weekend is, number 1, as Reverend Yearwood mentioned, is defunding the police. And we know that as we are able to move money away from policing, that we know inherently harms Black and brown communities, we can move that into things like regenerative energy, into healthcare, into housing, into all of the things that make up the green vision that we're working for with the climate justice future. The second demand is to, as I was saying, invest those resources back into Black communities. And the third and final one is the resignation of Donald Trump. And as Reverend Yearwood was giving with this context of the hate, the division, the assaults on communities of color must stop now. And so that begins with removing this president from office and being able to relocate power in communities. So again, 619.com, looking forward to seeing you all in the streets. And one last plug, if you're not, I know with the pandemic, there's also lots of options for taking action virtually as well. If you go to that website, there's also lots of virtual events that you can join, get educated, learn more, if that's a safer and better option for you. And if you do show up to protests, I just put in here, the Movement for Black Lives has released a really incredible, extensive guide on how to stay safe, if you are showing up for protests and be in line with COVID guidelines. So looks like for that, let's see, Scott or anyone else, is there any other questions in the chat before we wrap up?
Not right now, but if anyone has questions that you're still itching to have answered, you can always email us at organizing@rand.org and we'll connect you to the right people. We've shared lots of links in the chat today, so hopefully those lead you in the right direction.
It's actually organizinghelp@rand.org.
Thank you for correcting me, Scott.
Excellent. Well, we're right at the top of the hour. So again, thank you so much to Lauren Regan and to Reverend Yearwood for joining us this evening and always benefiting from your expertise and inspiration. And thank you all for tuning in, and we'll keep you posted on how to take action.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Have a good night, folks.